I moved to this small town looking for peace. After the chaos of the last few months, after my brother's sudden and inexplicable death, I needed a place where I could escape the city, the questions, the memories. The house I rented seemed perfect. Tucked away at the edge of town, it had that old charm. The kind of place where the walls felt thick enough to keep the world out. For the first few days, it worked. It really did. The locals didn't ask too many questions, which suited me just fine. They were polite but distant, like they had their own lives to worry about and no time to pry into mine. I appreciated that. After everything, the last thing I needed was sympathy from strangers who didn't know the first thing about my brother or what had happened. He was gone, and no amount of kind words or sideways glances was going to change that. I spent my first few nights in the house trying to unpack, but more often than not, I found myself staring out the windows. The view from my bedroom overlooked a quiet stretch of woods. Nothing special, really, but at night there was something about it that made me feel watched. Not in an obvious way, more like an uncomfortable sensation crawling up the back of my neck. But I told myself it was just the newness of the place, the unfamiliar quiet. The nights here were too still, too silent compared to the hum of the city I had lived in. I figured I'd get used to it eventually. That first strange night happened about a week after I moved in. I had been sleeping better than I expected, but something woke me up. I don't know if it was a sound, a shift in the air, or some instinctive sense of danger, but I sat up in bed, wide awake, heart pounding in my chest. It was quiet, too quiet, and for a moment I thought maybe I had dreamed the whole thing, until I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. I held my breath, straining to figure out where it was coming from. At first, I thought it was something inside the house. Pipes, maybe? Or the creaking of the old wood settling. But no, this sound was coming from outside. My window. I got up, telling myself I was being ridiculous. It was probably just a branch brushing against the glass. Nothing sinister, nothing to be afraid of. I approached the window, and for a second I hesitated. That same sense of being watched crept up on me again, dust prickling at the base of my neck. I brushed it off, convinced that my mind was playing tricks on me, that it was just the quiet of the town getting to me. I pulled the curtain back and looked outside. Nothing, just the same stretch of woods bathed in moonlight, the trees swaying gently in the wind. I exhaled a shaky breath and went back to bed, trying to laugh at myself for being so paranoid. I didn't sleep much that night, though. The next night, it happened again. I woke up, this time more abruptly, like something had jerked me out of sleep, and there it was, the tapping. This time, I didn't hesitate. I pulled the curtains back quickly, hoping to catch whatever it was, but again, there was nothing, just the empty yard and the dark silhouette of the woods. My heart was racing again, and even though I couldn't see anything, I felt that same unsettling sensation that I wasn't alone. The logical part of my brain told me it was just the wind, that the house was old and probably making noises it had made for decades. But another part of me, the part that had been restless ever since my brother's death, wasn't so sure. By the third night, the tapping had become louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a faint noise anymore. It was deliberate. Like someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. The sound came in steady intervals, a slow, rhythmic knock that seemed almost calculated. Always at the same time, midnight. I didn't want to acknowledge it, didn't want to believe that there was something more to it. I tried ignoring it, tried pulling the pillow over my head and telling myself it would stop, that it had to be some animal or trick of the wind. But the more I ignored it, the louder it seemed to get, until I couldn't take it anymore. I threw the curtains open and stared out, expecting, wanting to see something, anything that could explain the noise. But the yard was still empty. The woods were still quiet. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie light over everything. And that's when I noticed it. The window. The one I had been hearing the tapping on. It was slightly ajar. I didn't remember opening it. In fact, I was sure I had closed it the night before. But now, there it was, cracked open just enough to let in a whisper of cool night air. I slammed it shut, locking it this time, and backed away, heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to laugh it off, but deep down, something felt wrong, very wrong. That night, I had my first dream about the window. In the dream, I was standing in front of it, just like I had done earlier that night, looking out at the same stretch of woods. But this time, I wasn't alone. There was someone, or something, on the other side of the glass, tapping. I couldn't see it clearly. It was just a dark shape, a silhouette. It didn't move or speak, but I knew it wanted to get inside. I could feel its intention, the weight of its presence pressing against the window, begging to be let in. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. It had felt so real, more real than any dream I had ever had. I glanced at the window, half expecting to see it open again, but it was still closed, still locked. I tried to push the dream from my mind, tried to tell myself it was just the stress, the lingering grief over my brother's death messing with my head. But the feeling of dread, of being watched, lingered. The next day, I walked into town, hoping to distract myself with something mundane. But as I passed by the small grocery store, I overheard a conversation between two older women. They were talking in hushed tones, and even though I tried not to eavesdrop, one word caught my attention. Window. I froze, my stomach twisting into a knot. They didn't say much, just a few sentences, but I heard enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Something about a boy and the window, and no one ever figured out what really happened. I didn't want to believe it was connected to what I had been experiencing. I didn't want to think that my brother's death and the strange occurrences at the house could be linked in any way. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they were. After that day in town, things started to shift in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't just the tapping anymore. Something else had settled into my life. Like an unwelcome guest I couldn't see, but always felt lurking in the background. The unease that had started as a faint whisper in the back of my mind was now a constant presence, humming just beneath the surface of everything I did. The tapping didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder. Always at midnight, always rhythmic, like some twisted lullaby that wouldn't let me sleep. It was no longer something I could ignore. It dominated my nights, keeping me awake long after the sound itself had faded. I found myself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the first knock to echo through the room. My body had become attuned to it, anticipating it with an anxiety that gnawed at my insides. I stopped sleeping properly. The dark circles under my eyes deepened, and my thoughts became sluggish, slow, as though I were wading through some thick, unseen fog. My dreams, when they did come, were worse than the tapping. In them, the window was always there, front and center, with something standing on the other side, its silhouette barely discernible through the glass. It never moved, never spoke, but the weight of its presence was unbearable, suffocating. And then there was the feeling, the overwhelming sense that it wanted something from me, something I didn't understand, something I wasn't sure I could give. The susurrations started not long after that. At first, they were faint, barely more than a whisper of sound mixed in with the tapping. I didn't notice them at first, too consumed by the rhythmic knocking to pick up on anything else. But one night, as I lay in bed, unable to close my eyes, I realized there was more to the sound than just the knocking. There were voices, faint, indistinct, like a distant conversation just out of earshot. I sat up, my pulse quickening, and strained to listen. The whispers were coming from outside. I was sure of it, from the window. I threw the covers off and crossed the room in a few quick strides, my heart pounding in my chest. For the first time, I hesitated before pulling back the curtain. There was a part of me, the rational, sane part of me, that didn't want to look, that didn't want to see what might be on the other side of the glass. But I couldn't stop myself. My hand moved on its own, pulling the fabric aside. The yard was empty. The woods stood silent and still, bathed in pale moonlight. There was nothing out there, no one. But the whispers, I could still hear them, faint and maddening, like they were coming from all around me, yet nowhere at all. I slammed the window shut again, harder than I meant to, and stepped back, trying to calm the rising panic in my chest. The whispers faded, but they left something behind, a sense of dread so thick it was almost palpable. It clung to the air, to my skin, making the house feel colder, darker, as though the shadows in the corners had deepened when I wasn't looking. That night, I barely slept. I tossed and turned, haunted by the memory of the whispers and the tapping that now seemed to fill the entire house, echoing off the walls, the floor, the ceiling. And when I did finally drift off, the dreams came again, darker this time, more oppressive. The window in my dream wasn't just a barrier between me and the thing outside anymore. It was open, wide open, and I was standing there, frozen, as something dark and formless crawled its way through the frame, slipping into the room like smoke. When I woke, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The house felt different, like it wasn't just mine anymore, like something else had claimed it. I decided I couldn't just sit there, waiting for the next tap, the next whisper, the next dream. I had to find out what was happening, what had happened to my brother. His death had always been a mystery, a shadow hanging over everything I did, but now it felt more personal, more immediate. The conversation I had overheard in town echoed in my mind. The window, they had said. No one ever figured out what really happened. I needed answers. I spent the next few days digging through old boxes of my brother's belongings, things I had taken with me after the funeral but hadn't had the strength to open until now. I found his journals, his notebooks, things he had written in the months before he died. Most of it was mundane, thoughts about work, little notes to himself about things he needed to remember. But buried deep in one of the journals, I found something that made my blood run cold. He had written about the window. The entry was short, scrawled hastily across the page as though he hadn't wanted to linger on the thought. The window, he had written, I keep hearing it every night. The tapping, always at midnight. I thought it was just the wind at first, but it's too deliberate, too rhythmic. Like someone is knocking, trying to get in. I'm trying not to think about it, but it's getting harder. The dreams are worse. The thing outside, it wants to come in. I can't let it in. I can't. My hands were shaking by the time I finished reading. He had heard it too. The same tapping, the same whispers, the same nightmares. I wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, that I was seeing connections where there weren't any. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't just in my head, it was real. I spent the rest of that day in a haze, my mind reeling from the realization that whatever had happened to my brother was now happening to me. The weight of it pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. I found myself constantly glancing toward the window, half expecting to see the shadowy figure from my dreams standing there, watching me. That night, the tapping came again, louder than ever before. It was no longer just a faint knock. It was a demand, a relentless pounding that rattled the glass and sent shivers down my spine. And the whispers, they were clearer now. I could almost make out words, though they were still just out of reach, frustratingly elusive. I stayed in bed, gripping the sheets tightly, telling myself I wouldn't get up, that I wouldn't go to the window this time. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the entire house was shaking with the force of it. My resolve crumbled, and I found myself stumbling toward the window, heart pounding in my ears. I threw the curtain back, expecting to see the empty yard again, the silent woods. But this time, there was something there, a figure. It stood just beyond the edge of the trees, barely visible in the pale moonlight. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just watching. I couldn't make out any details, couldn't see a face or anything that would distinguish it as human. It was just a dark silhouette, standing perfectly still in the shadows. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. I wanted to run, to leave the house and never look back, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. And then, slowly, it turned and disappeared into the woods. The tapping stopped. After that night, I couldn't shake the image of the figure standing at the edge of the woods. It haunted me during the day, in the quiet hours when I tried to busy myself with menial tasks, and even more at night when the tapping started again like clockwork. The days began to blur together, each one folding into the next in a haze of sleeplessness and dread. I hadn't told anyone about what I'd seen. Who would believe me? I wasn't sure I even believed myself. The town was small, and everyone kept to themselves. The thought of walking into the local bar or grocery store and telling someone I was being haunted by something outside my window, it seemed absurd. I could already see the polite, skeptical smiles, the way they'd nod and say, maybe you should get some rest. Or worse, the pitying looks when they found out about my brother. But it wasn't just the tapping and the figure in the woods anymore. Other things had started happening, little things that chipped away at my already fragile sense of reality. Doors I was sure I had locked were found ajar. Objects would move from one side of the room to the other without explanation. I'd leave a book on the kitchen table, only to find it on the living room floor a few hours later. At first, I thought it was my exhaustion. Maybe I was forgetting where I put things, or sleepwalking without realizing it. But the more it happened, the more I couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation that something else was at work. Then came the voices. It started one night, around the same time as the tapping. At first, they were faint, just like the whispers I had heard outside the window. But this time, they weren't coming from outside. They were inside the house. I had been sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself by watching TV. It was late, but I was too wired to sleep. The tapping had already begun, though I had forced myself to ignore it. But as I sat there, pretending to be engrossed in the mindless chatter of the television, I heard something else. Voices, low, murmuring, like someone having a conversation in the next room. I muted the TV, my pulse quickening. The voices continued, a steady stream of sound that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but there was something familiar about them, something that sent a cold chill down my spine. Slowly I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me as I made my way toward the source of the noise. It seemed to be coming from the hallway that led to my bedroom. Every step I took felt heavier, as though the air itself had thickened, pressing down on me, urging me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know what was causing it. As I reached the door to my bedroom, the voices stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that made my ears ring. I stood there, hand hovering over the doorknob, unsure if I wanted to open it. But then, just as I was about to retreat, I heard it. A single voice. Clear. Distinct. My brother's voice. Andre. I froze. It wasn't possible. My brother was dead. I had buried him. I had seen his lifeless body in the casket, pale and still, and yet here he was, calling my name from the other side of the door. Andre, let me in. The words sent a wave of terror through me, paralyzing me where I stood. It sounded like him, his voice, his tone, but there was something off about it, something cold and detached, like he was reciting lines in a play rather than speaking to me. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest, and slammed the door to my bedroom shut without ever opening it. I didn't care what was on the other side. I couldn't face it. Not yet. The tapping continued that night, louder than ever, but I stayed huddled in the living room, too terrified to move, too terrified to even breathe. When dawn finally broke, I gathered the little courage I had left and fled the house, needing to escape the suffocating sense of dread that had taken hold. I wandered aimlessly through town, my thoughts racing. How could I explain what was happening? How could I even begin to make sense of it? I didn't want to believe it was real, but the alternative, that I was losing my mind, was somehow worse. By the time I returned to the house, the sun was already setting. I hadn't eaten all day, and my hands were shaking from hunger and exhaustion, but I couldn't bring myself to step foot inside. I stood outside for what felt like hours, staring at the windows, half expecting to see the figure from the woods standing there, waiting for me. But the windows remained dark, empty. Finally, I forced myself inside, locking the door behind me with a trembling hand. The house was quiet, too quiet. It was as though the air had been sucked out, leaving behind a vacuum of silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I didn't bother turning on the lights. Somehow it felt safer to move through the house in the dark, like if I couldn't see it, it couldn't see me. But as I made my way to the kitchen, a sound stopped me in my tracks. It was the front door. The knob was rattling, as though someone on the other side was trying to open it. I turned, every muscle in my body tensing as I watched the door shake. The rattling grew louder, more frantic, until the entire doorframe seemed to be vibrating. For a brief, terrifying moment, I thought it was going to break off its hinges. Andre, the voice came again, low and insistent, this time from the other side of the door. Andre, let me in. I backed away, shaking my head, my pulse thundering in my ears. It was him. It was my brother. But how? How could this be happening? The rattling stopped abruptly, and the house fell silent once more. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. Slowly, I crept toward the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I peered through the peephole, half expecting to see the figure from my dreams, or worse, my brother, standing there, waiting for me to open the door. But there was nothing, just the empty front porch and the stillness of the night. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and collapsed onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. What was happening to me? Was I losing my mind? Or was there something more sinister at play? I couldn't tell anymore. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred to the point where I wasn't sure which was which. In the following days, I became obsessed with finding answers. I couldn't let this go on. I had to understand what was happening, why the tapping and the voices wouldn't stop, why my brother's voice was haunting me. I spent hours researching, poring over old records from the town's library, desperate for any clue that might explain the strange occurrences. And that's when I found it. A story, buried in the archives of the town's local paper. It was old, from decades ago, but the details were eerily similar to what I was experiencing. A young boy, not much older than my brother had been, had died under mysterious circumstances. The official report listed it as an accident, but the locals whispered about something else. Something about a window. Apparently, the boy had been hearing tapping at his window for weeks before he died. He had told his parents, but they hadn't believed him. One night, the tapping had stopped, and when they went to check on him, they found the window open. The boy was gone. They found his body in the woods the next morning, twisted and broken, as though he had fallen from a great height. But the strange thing was, there was no place near the house where he could have fallen from. No cliffs, no tall trees, just the woods. The story sent a chill down my spine. Could it be connected? Was this the same thing that had happened to my brother? The same thing that was happening to me? I didn't know. But one thing was clear. Whatever it wasn't done with me yet. That night, as I lay in bed, waiting for the inevitable tapping to begin, I couldn't help but think about the boy in the story, about how he had opened the window, about how he had disappeared into the night, only to be found dead in the woods. The tapping came, right on schedule, but this time, I didn't get up. I stayed in bed, clutching the covers, telling myself I wouldn't open the window. I wouldn't let it in. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time. The next few days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and growing paranoia. The tapping never stopped. It continued relentlessly. Always at midnight, always with that same slow, rhythmic knock. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and each time I heard them, they felt closer. Closer to me, closer to the house, closer to breaking through whatever thin barrier still separated them from me. I tried everything I could think of to stop it. I nailed the windows shut. I blocked them with furniture, taped over the seams, even shoved towels into the cracks. But every night, without fail, the tapping returned. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't stay in the house. But I couldn't leave, either. It felt like whatever was out there had locked onto me, like it wouldn't matter if I ran. It would follow me wherever I went. It wasn't just the house anymore, either. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, had seeped into every corner of my life. I felt it when I walked through town, when I stood in line at the grocery store, when I drove down the quiet, empty roads late at night. I would catch glimpses of something in the corner of my eye, something moving just out of sight, just beyond the edge of my vision. A shadow, a figure, and always, the whisper of my brother's voice calling my name. It was driving me mad. I stopped going into town. I stopped answering phone calls, stopped checking emails. I couldn't handle the outside world anymore. Every time I tried to engage with normal life, it felt like I was being pulled deeper into something dark and suffocating. The house had become my prison, but at least within its walls, I knew what I was dealing with. Outside, it felt like I was constantly on the verge of seeing something I wasn't supposed to. Something that had been waiting for me. I spent hours sitting by the window, watching the woods. I didn't know what I was looking for anymore. Maybe I expected the figure to come back, to stand there at the tree line like it had before, watching me. Maybe I was waiting for it to step out from the shadows and approach the house, to finally reveal itself. Or maybe I was waiting for something worse, something I couldn't even name. I couldn't stop thinking about my brother, his voice, the way he had said my name that night, the way he had asked to be let in. I tried to convince myself it wasn't really him, that it was something else, something using his voice, his memory to torment me. But the more I thought about it, the more I doubted myself. What if it was him? What if I had left him out there, alone, when all he wanted was to come inside? The guilt gnawed at me, eating away at what little sanity I had left. My brother and I had always been close. Even in the months before he died, when things had gotten strange between us, I had always felt a deep, unspoken connection with him. But I hadn't been there for him when he needed me most. I hadn't been there to protect him. And now he was out there, tapping on my window, calling my name, asking to come in. I don't know when I made the decision, but one night I found myself standing in front of the window, staring out at the darkness. The tapping had started again, louder this time, more desperate. It echoed through the house, vibrating through the walls, and for the first time I didn't feel afraid. I felt resigned. I knew what I had to do. I reached for the window latch, my hand trembling slightly, and hesitated. The voices were louder now, filling the room, swirling around me like a cold wind. I could hear my brother's voice, clear as day, calling my name over and over again. Andre, Andre, let me in. I slid the window open. The cold night air rushed in, carrying with it a sudden, overwhelming silence. The tapping stopped. The voices stopped. Everything fell still, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. For a moment, I stood there, staring out at the dark yard, at the trees beyond. There was nothing there. No figure, no shadow, just the night, vast and empty. I felt a strange sense of relief, like maybe it had all been in my head, like maybe opening the window had broken the spell. But then I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement at the edge of the woods. A dark shape, barely visible in the moonlight, moving toward me. Slowly, deliberately, my breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back from the window, but it was too late. The figure was coming closer now, stepping out of the shadows and into the dim light of the yard. I could see it clearly this time. It was my brother. He looked the same as he had the last time I'd seen him. His face was pale, his eyes wide and hollow, his expression blank. But there was something wrong with him, something about the way he moved. It was stiff, unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. His head tilted to the side, and his eyes locked onto mine. Andre? His voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but I heard it clear as day. It sent a shiver down my spine, and I backed away from the window, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. This wasn't possible. He was dead. He had been dead for months. But here he was, standing in the yard, looking up at me with those lifeless eyes. Andre, let me in. I shook my head, stepping further away from the window. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing made sense anymore. The world had stopped making sense the moment I had opened the window. He took a step forward, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair behind me. His eyes followed my movements, unblinking, unrelenting. Andre? He was closer now, standing just below the window, his hand reaching up toward the glass. I could see the faint outline of his breath in the cold night air, but his skin was so pale, so cold-looking, like it hadn't seen the sun in months, like it belonged to someone who had been buried. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Andre, let me in. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, staring at him. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. My brother, if it was him, just stood there, waiting, his hand pressed lightly against the glass. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my body refused to cooperate. I was trapped, helpless, as he continued to stare at me with those empty, hollow eyes. Then, slowly, his hand moved to the window latch. The sound of it clicking open snapped me out of my paralysis, and I lunged forward, slamming the window shut just as his fingers began to curl around the edge of the frame. I locked it, my hands shaking violently, and backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. For a moment, nothing happened. The yard outside was empty again. The figure, my brother, was gone. The air felt lighter, less oppressive, and for the briefest second, I thought it was over. I thought I had stopped it, but then the tapping started again. This time, it wasn't coming from the window, it was coming from the door. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat as I stared at the front door. The sound was soft at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart, but it grew louder with each passing second. More insistent, more demanding. A steady, rhythmic knock. My brother's voice followed. Andre, let me in. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I couldn't open the door. I couldn't let him in. But the tapping continued, relentless, and his voice, it wouldn't stop. Andre, please. Tears filled my eyes as I pressed my back against the wall, sliding down to the floor. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't take it. The weight of it all. The guilt, the fear, the not knowing. It was crushing me. Andre? I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it all out. The tapping, the voice, everything. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape it. It was inside me now, deep in my bones, in my blood. Andre, let me in. The knocking stopped. For a long moment, I didn't move. I didn't open my eyes. I just sat there, waiting, expecting the sound to return. But the house was silent again, the air still. Cautiously, I opened my eyes, glancing toward the door. It was closed, locked. But the window was wide open. I never saw what came through it. I only felt the cold brush of the air as the darkness finally slipped inside.